These yellow growths on the rocks here are one of the most primitive groups of animals. In fact, one might be forgiven for thinking that it's not really an animal at all, either a seaweed or some other sort of growth on the rock. But these are sponges, they're unable to move, and they actually don't have any body organs or sense organs. They're just like a collaborative group of cells that live together and have formed themselves into a larger organism. So one of the most famous early experiments about sponges, for example, was that the researcher took a sponge and then broke it up and put it through a sieve and then left all the cells in a bowl of water, and then over the next few days those cells reconstituted themselves back into a sponge again. What? So it's a bit like buying a couple of 100 kilograms of hamburger meat, leaving it in the fridge, and then you come in the morning and there's a cow there. Oh. So if you look at the surfaces of most sponges, they're covered with little tiny pores, and then the sponge will suck in water through those pores, and that's actually being done by individual cells that have a hair on the end of them, and the little hair beats like a propeller and sucks the water in. So it sucks the water in, and that little hair sieves out food particles from the water, and the wastewater is ejected through what are usually much larger holes that are much more widespread on the sponge surface. So you'll often see these like chimneys sticking up from the surface of the sponge, and that's where the wastewater comes out.
Okay, so that's why they're often in that shape with a little turret.
That's right, they very often have quite tall turrets. And actually there's some very cool experiments that you can see on other YouTube channels where people have taken a food dye and then released it at the base of one of those tall chimney-like sponges, and within a few seconds the dye gets sucked into the sponge and blows out of the chimney. So despite the fact that the animal itself is not moving, it's actually pumping water at quite a significant rate.
And presumably getting tiny little food particles out.
Yes, and it can filter out particles that are as small as 1 micron, that's 1,000th of a millimeter across, even things the size of bacteria. So because sponges are actually very common on many reefs, then they play a significant role in keeping the water clear. And if you have a sponge in your fish tank, for example, it's very effective at keeping the water beautifully clear. So it has a finer resolution than your filter that you paid thousands of rands for from the pet shop, in fact. There are two main groups of sponges. The one group are called silica sponges, and the spicules, or the skeleton of the sponge, is made out of silica, which is more or less like glass fiber. It's like little spikes of glass. So those sponges, you certainly don't want to use them to wash your body. And in fact, on some beaches where this type of sponge is very common, then the beach sand has so many of these little glass spicules in it that it's actually uncomfortable to walk on. So Hout Bay Beach here on the Cape Peninsula is well known for that. In most sponges, the skeleton is made out of a soft, squishy material called spongin. So this is a more typical sponge. It's all squishy. I can squish it up, and when I let it go, it expands. And this one actually has quite distinct chimneys with a large opening at the end where the water comes out.
Looks like a bath sponge.
So this is like a bath sponge, and if you find a nice large specimen of this type of sponge on the drift line, you can actually take it home and wash it, get all the sand and bits of shell out of it, and then dry it in the sun, and then you have a very nice sponge to wash yourself or wash your car. You just have to make sure you get all the sand out of it, otherwise you're going to scratch your paintwork. But fortunately, almost all the sponges that we buy these days are artificially made out of plastics, which is not a bad thing, because countless millions of lives of little sponges have been saved by the fact that we don't harvest them anymore.
But what eats these sponges? I mean, I've noticed a little yellow nudibranch, which is often sitting on this orange sponge that you were holding.
Yes, one of the reasons sponges are quite successful is that they're not very good to eat, so there's not a lot of energy in them. And because they've got these spicules in them, and they have also a lot of defensive chemicals in them, then they tend to be avoided by predators. And in fact, they tend to be a favored organism for biochemists who are looking for drugs to cure cancer or kill bacteria. They have a lot of defensive chemicals in them. But there are a few organisms that do eat them, and one of the best known of these are sea slugs or nudibranchs. So some nudibranchs have specialized in eating just a particular species of sponge, and they're often perfectly disguised in terms of their color and surface texture, so that it's really hard to see them against the surface of those sponges. Although sponges are such simple organisms, it's a very successful body plan, and sponges are extremely common, and there are many hundreds, in fact thousands of different species, and they can make up a lot of the fauna of reef areas. They come in a whole variety of different shapes. Perhaps the most common are encrusting sponges that just creep out on the surface of the rocks like a carpet, but some of them make walls, some of them make vases, some of them make chimneys, and some of them are even like trees. And they also vary enormously in sizes. Some of them have an adult size just a few millimeters long, and some of the largest vase sponges are like the size of a fridge or even a small car. They're enormous. They're as tall as a person. So they're a very successful group. They just haven't bothered to get life too complicated.
If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe and you'll be notified when our next episode drops.